Officer Daniel Hayes had served in the Willow Creek Police Department for nearly 12 years, but nothing in his career, no case, no confrontation, no commendation, had ever meant as much to him as the moment he first locked eyes with the trembling, half-starved German shepherd huddled in the corner of a busted-up drug house during a late-night raid that went sideways before it even began. The team had stormed in expecting resistance, but what they found in that dark, fetid basement was something else entirely. Cages stacked atop each other, some filled with half-dead dogs, others already emptied by despair. And in the farthest, coldest corner, a single set of amber eyes stared back at Daniel through the shadows, not with fear, but with something heavier. Resignation, maybe, as if the animal had already decided he wasn't worth saving. But Daniel knelt there for a long time, even after the raid was over and backup had cleared the scene, just staring at the dog, speaking to him in low tones he barely recognized as his own, until the shepherd, matted, bleeding, ribs like blades beneath filthy fur, crawled forward, slowly, like every movement hurt, and placed his head in Daniel's outstretched hand with a gentleness that shattered something deep inside the hardened cop's chest. From that moment on, Daniel couldn't let him go, not when the shelter vet said the dog might not survive the week, not when the department warned him about the psychological risks of keeping a traumatized animal, not even when his own grief tried to tell him he wasn't fit to care for another soul. Because Daniel, too, was broken in ways he never spoke about, his nights still haunted by the last call he ever got from his partner, Mike, who had bled out before Daniel could reach him during a warehouse ambush 3 years ago, a failure that lived behind his eyes like a ghost. He named the dog Ghost, partly for his coat once it began to grow back, but mostly for the way he moved, quiet, deliberate, like he didn't want the world to notice him unless he decided otherwise. And together they learned to walk again, slowly, step by painful step. Ghost had to relearn trust, how to eat without flinching, how to sleep without nightmares, while Daniel had to remember how to speak with something other than detachment, how to feel without crumbling. It started with morning walks around the lake, both of them silent at first. Daniel sipping his black coffee, Ghost staying exactly one pace behind, never tugging, never leading, just following, like he needed Daniel to tell him it was okay to be there. And it was. More than okay. It was life-saving. And Daniel knew it the first time he heard Ghost bark in his sleep, chasing something in his dreams, and again the first time Ghost nosed Daniel's hand during a thunderstorm, sensing the way his pulse had spiked from memories too dark to name. With time and patience and more setbacks than Daniel could count, Ghost began to emerge. Not just physically, with his glossy black and tan coat and strong frame, but spiritually, with his head held higher, his tail loose and curious, his eyes bright with a strange kind of joy that Daniel had long forgotten dogs could feel. When the department's K-9 division offered to assess Ghost, Daniel was hesitant. He didn't want to turn him into a tool, but Ghost surprised everyone, not with aggression or obedience, but with loyalty so intense it bordered on spiritual. He passed the tests. Not because he was the best trained, but because he never left Daniel's side. Not for 1 second, not even during the gunfire simulation, when other dogs fled or hesitated. Ghost stood in front of Daniel, shielding him with his chest, silent and unmoving, a wall of muscle and courage that left the evaluators stunned and Daniel speechless. They became partners officially 6 months later, and their first case together was small, tracking a lost boy through the forest. But it ended in triumph when Ghost found the child curled beneath a log, cold and shivering, and lay beside him until help arrived, refusing to leave even when the medics tried to lift the boy. After that, the town began to know Ghost, not just as a police dog, but as a hero in his own right. Children waved at him during patrols. Elderly folks brought treats to the precinct just to thank him. And every time Daniel saw Ghost interact with someone, he felt a part of himself start to heal, like the dog had taken his brokenness and slowly, silently, stitched it back together with each act of loyalty, each quiet look. But the greatest test of their bond came one winter evening, when a domestic call turned into a hostage situation in a remote cabin outside town. A man with nothing left to lose had barricaded himself and his daughter inside, threatening to shoot if anyone came near. And as the negotiators struggled, Daniel and Ghost were called in as the last resort. Crawling through snow and shadow, Daniel reached the back of the cabin, and Ghost stayed beside him, breathing slow and steady, sensing the tension in his handler's every movement. When the time came, Daniel whispered a single command, "Stay," and moved forward to breach the door. But Ghost, sensing something Daniel didn't, disobeyed for the first time in his life and lunged ahead just as a shot rang out from the window. The bullet missed Daniel by inches, but grazed Ghost along the flank, a burst of blood staining the snow, and Daniel screamed, a raw, primal sound he hadn't made since Mike's death, as he dragged Ghost back behind cover, pressing his hand over the wound and begging, pleading, swearing every oath he knew if only the dog would stay with him. Ghost did, barely, his eyes fixed on Daniel's face the whole time. And when the medics came, when the standoff ended and the girl was rescued, all Daniel could think about was the way Ghost had chosen him again, even when it meant pain, even when it meant disobedience, even when it meant dying. The surgery was long, the recovery longer, but Ghost pulled through, and when he finally stood again, limping slightly but proud, the whole precinct applauded, and Daniel cried openly in front of his brothers in blue, holding Ghost's head in his arms like he'd won back a piece of his soul. In the months that followed, they returned to duty slowly, picking their cases carefully. But something had shifted. Their bond was no longer just one of survival. It was sacred, forged through blood and trust and sacrifice. And even when Daniel retired 3 years later, he didn't hesitate for a second to take Ghost with him, home to a quiet little house near the lake where they had once walked in silence, now filled with laughter and peace and the smell of bacon on weekend mornings. Daniel built Ghost a padded bed beside the fireplace, though the dog rarely used it, preferring instead to rest at Daniel's feet or on the porch watching birds as the sun set. They aged together, not gracefully but honestly, with creaky joints and long naps and soft music playing from the radio as Daniel read aloud from old case files or scribbled in a worn notebook filled with thoughts he'd never shared before. Not even with Mike. Ghost listened to it all, eyes half closed, tail thumping gently, as if telling Daniel it was all right to remember, all right to grieve, all right to finally let go. And when Ghost's time came, on a warm spring day with the scent of lilacs on the breeze, he didn't suffer, didn't whine or fight, just rested his head in Daniel's lap and let his breathing slow while Daniel whispered stories into his ear. The day they met, the day they saved the boy, the day Ghost saved him. Daniel buried him beneath the tree they used to sit under, with Ghost's badge engraved in a stone that read, "Loyal until the last breath." And though the house felt quieter afterward, it was not empty. Not truly, for Daniel knew that some bonds don't break with death, they simply become part of you. and every time he looked at the badge hanging by the fireplace, he could still feel the weight of Ghost's gaze, still hear his breath in the stillness, still remember the way a broken dog and a broken man had saved each other without ever saying a single word. And in the years that followed, even as Daniel grew older and the world around him shifted in quiet, imperceptible ways, the rising of new buildings where old diners once stood, the fading of names from plaques on police station walls, the slower pace of his own steps, he carried Ghost with him, not just in memory but in movement, in ritual, in every breath that reminded him what it meant to love and be loved so completely by a creature that never asked for anything more than his presence. Daniel began to volunteer part-time at the local shelter, the same one that had once nursed Ghost back to life. And each time a skittish dog flinched at human contact or a frightened pup cowered in the corner, Daniel would kneel slowly, extend his hand with quiet patience, and speak in the same low, steady voice he once used on a cold, silent basement floor. The tone Ghost had first trusted. It was as if he was lending Ghost's strength to others, passing on the healing they had fought so hard to earn. Sometimes, children from the neighborhood would gather on his porch in the afternoons, their backpacks still slung across their shoulders, drawn by the rumors of the dog hero's house. And Daniel, soft-eyed and smiling faintly, would invite them in for lemonade and stories, pulling out faded photographs and a chewed-up tennis ball Ghost had always carried on rainy days, and the children would listen, eyes wide, as Daniel spoke not just of police work, but of loyalty, sacrifice, and the power of quiet companionship that spoke louder than any siren or badge ever could. It was during one of these storytelling afternoons that a young boy named Caleb, no older than 10 and battling a painful stutter, approached Daniel after the others had left, clutching a wrinkled notebook and asking, through halting words, if he could write Ghost's story down for a school project. And Daniel, moved in a way he hadn't expected, handed Caleb an old case file filled with scribbles and said, "Write it how you feel it, not how I lived it." Weeks later, when the boy returned with a bound little book titled The Silent Hero, Daniel read it by the fireplace, tears in his eyes and Ghost's collar clutched in his hand, stunned by how deeply the boy had understood the unspoken bond between man and dog. Soon, local newspapers picked up the story, and eventually, a regional publisher released a small print run of the book, which sold out faster than anyone imagined. Not because it was a bestseller, but because it was real, raw, and resonated with every person who had ever loved something that couldn't speak, yet said everything with its eyes. The town responded by funding a new dog therapy wing at the shelter, naming it Ghost's Haven, and Daniel, now seen not just as a retired cop but as a guardian of stories and souls, was asked to cut the ribbon, a moment he faced with trembling hands and misty eyes, whispering Ghost's name under his breath as he stood before the crowd. He found himself pulled deeper into community life than ever before, giving talks at schools and community centers about resilience, using Ghost's journey as a metaphor for healing. And though public speaking had never been his strength, he spoke with a gentle authority that quieted rooms and stirred hearts, because every word was born from truth, from a love that had outlasted grief. And then, one winter, while returning from a memorial ceremony for fallen officers, Daniel slipped on a patch of black ice and fractured his hip, an injury that, at his age, brought complications and months of recovery. And as he lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling through pain and painkillers, all he wanted was Ghost, just to feel his breath, to know he wasn't alone. Instead, he was met by a nurse who brought him a package, a soft, plush toy of a German shepherd, and a card that read, "Still watching over you." Ghost. Signed anonymously, though Daniel had his suspicions. The gesture broke something open in him, and when he returned home, now with a cane and a slight limp, he sat by the fireplace that first night, holding the plush and feeling the silence wrap around him like a blanket. And he whispered, "You're still here, aren't you, boy?" Just as he had every night since Ghost passed. And for a moment, he could almost hear the soft thump of a tail in response. Seasons changed, years passed, and the day eventually came when Daniel felt his own body slowing too much. The ache in his chest heavier than usual, the walks shorter, the porch colder. He knew his time was drawing close, not with fear, but with readiness. A kind of quiet peace he hadn't felt since that first moment in the basement all those years ago. On his final morning, sunlight spilling through the curtains, the world outside painted in gold, Daniel made himself a cup of coffee, sat in his favorite chair, and opened a scrapbook filled with Ghost's life. Photos of patrols, rescues, lazy afternoons by the lake, community awards, and that first photo of a battered shepherd resting his head in a cop's hand. And he smiled, tears slipping freely down his cheeks, not out of sorrow, but out of fullness, a love saturated with meaning. Later that afternoon, neighbors found him still sitting there, coffee cold, scrapbook open on his lap, a peaceful expression on his face, and the plush shepherd tucked gently in the crook of his arm. The funeral was attended by hundreds, officers from across the state, children he'd once read to, families whose lives he'd touched, and rescue dogs from Ghost's Haven, wearing small vests in the red, framed with love. And as the honor guard folded the flag and the bugler played taps, someone quietly placed Ghost's badge on Daniel's casket, a final reunion between two souls whose story never really ended, only transformed. In the years that followed, their legacy lived on, not just in the shelter, which expanded into a full rehabilitation center for abused animals, not just in the school books and community events, but in the way people spoke of them, not as a cop and a dog, but as a single story, a reminder that healing sometimes comes not through loud victories or bright lights, but in the silent loyalty of a friend who stays through every shadow, who guards your back even after death, and whose love, once given, echoes long after the world stops listening.